She sat quietly at the polling station, hat wide, photo in hand, history in her purse. They told her she couldn't vote. So she showed them a picture her hand in Dr. King's. Marching across Selma, some stories aren't written in ink, they're carried in scars and silence. If you believe in memory, justice, and quiet courage, subscribe. Because here, we don't just tell history, we carry it forward. The sun in South Ellington didn't rise. It peeled back the night like it was ashamed of what it was about to reveal. Light slanted between tall brick buildings, catching in broken window panes and glinting off the polished brass handles of boutiques that never served anyone who paid in cash. On Cypress Avenue, a place the realtors called historic, but the locals still called the Line, the world split sharply in two. To the east, Whole Foods, Pilates, organic dog treats. To the west, pawn shops, half-shuttered bodegas. A bus-stop shelter permanently scrawled with the words, "This city forgot us." And on the corner of Cypress and Jefferson, beneath a sycamore tree with roots that buckled the sidewalk like ancient knuckles pressing up from the dead, sat a woman no one truly saw except the children, and even they didn't know why they looked twice. Her name was Alma Geneva Williams, though the world had shrunk her name to just Miss Alma. She wore a sun hat wide enough to shade a child, with silk flowers pinned at the rim and a fading "I voted" sticker from a decade ago still clinging to the fabric. Her dress was the kind of blue you only see in church pews and family photo albums, deep, determined, and worn at the elbows. Every morning at exactly 7:45, Miss Alma rolled up a hand-woven blanket and tied it to Bo's back, the dog, the only soul she trusted enough to carry something worth anything. Bo was old, a retired K9 with a cloudy right eye and a stiff gait, but the mind sharp as a badge. His coat had thinned with the seasons, but his posture never changed. Straight back, alert, protective. The scars under his fur were maps of a past no one ever asked about. Just past them sat Luis Mercado, perched on a milk crate beside a dented shopping cart full of neatly labeled plastic tubs. Bolts, brushes, screws. A man who had once rebuilt engines for Black Hawk helicopters now fixed the brakes on electric wheelchairs and grocery carts, refusing pay, only asking for time. Down the block, Layla skipped alone, a jump rope dragging behind her like a forgotten thought. Her braids were tight, her shoes tighter. She never spoke much, but always whispered to Bo, who listened more carefully than any grown man she'd ever met. They were the fabric of the western side of Cypress. Not forgotten, just blurred, like old photographs someone had tried to wipe clean. But across the street, the world was crisp. There, Councilman Derek Harrow jogged in his brand new sneakers, earbuds glowing blue, his every motion curated for the possibility of a passing drone or a street photographer from the Ellington Gazette. His house, 3 blocks north, had the kind of lawn that screamed property value. He drove a black luxury sedan that never had a speck of dust, and his garbage bins had locks. He believed in rules, in merit, in order. And in the quiet of early morning, Derek Harrow looked across Cypress and saw something he couldn't quite name, but instinctively feared. Something chaotic, disorderly, something that didn't match the brochures his office printed every election year. He saw Miss Alma more than once. Harrow had said it on camera. We must protect the sanctity of the ballot. We must secure our democracy. To him, that meant voter ID, signature matches. No exceptions. To Alma, it meant something far older. Something that still echoed in the solace of her feet when she walked too long. Something she had carried in her lungs since 1965, when tear gas made her gasp and dogs were loosed on little girls in white dresses. Inside the local barber shop, as razors buzzed and politics churned like soap in the sink, a man named Ron said it plainly. The thing about South Ellington ain't that they hate the poor. It's that they wish they were invisible. Laughter. Nods. Someone muttered, "Tell that to Alma. She ain't going nowhere." By mid-morning, the city felt like a pressure cooker. The election was 4 days away, and everyone knew what was coming. Voter rolls had been purged. A new law passed under Harrow's oversight now required state-issued photo ID. Not a library card, not a utility bill. No exceptions, even for elders born before birth certificates were universal. And so the line was drawn not in ink, but in quiet gestures. A grocery clerk refusing BO entry. A security guard eyeing Louise like a threat at City Hall, even when he came just to fix the broken elevator switch. A boutique owner pulling Layla's arm away from the window, telling her not to smear it with her fingers. No one shouted. No one cursed, but each gesture cut like a clean blade. And Alma? She noticed everything. But she never stopped humming. "I seen this before," she said once to Louise as she handed him half a sandwich. "They changed the uniform, not the heart." "What do we do then?" Alma had smiled. "We show up. That's what we do. We show up, no matter how heavy the door." That night, Derek Harrow attended a fundraiser. Crystal glasses clinked. Finger food no one could pronounce was passed around by waiters with tired eyes. He gave a speech. "This city is safer, stronger, and more stable than it's ever been. We've restored trust in our institutions. We've re-established dignity in our systems." Applause, but none of those systems knew Alma, or BO, or Lise, or Layla, and none of them saw what was coming, because some doors, when slammed too hard for too long, don't just stay shut. They shattered out the world remembers noise. Protest signs, gunfire, speeches, but what about silence? Not the peaceful kind. The kind that settles like dust in places no one sweeps. The kind that wraps itself around old lives like plastic on forgotten furniture. That's the kind Alma Geneva Williams lived in every day and carried like gospel in her bones. Inside her modest one-bedroom apartment, above a shuttered soul food kitchen, the wallpaper peeled at the corners. The fan creaked like it had opinions. The carpet had stains older than Layla, but there was something holy about the space. Every item had a memory. A Bible, soft at the spine, pages dog-eared and outlined with pencil notes. 65, Selma, don't forget. Birmingham, Elijah bled here. Chicago, we marched. On the wall was a single photograph framed in wood rubbed so smooth it shone like glass. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., his hand clasping Alma's as they stepped off the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Her face in the photo looked almost unfamiliar now. Not because of age, but because of the fire in her eyes. She hadn't smiled. She hadn't needed to. The camera had caught something deeper. Something stronger than pride. And she had survived it all: clubs, spit, rubber bullets, and worse. But in 2025, it was a laminated voter ID card she didn't have that threatened to silence her. Lise Marcato didn't speak much. Unless you knew how to ask. He had once repaired M1 Abrams tanks under the blistering sun in Kandahar. He still kept the old uniform in a garment bag, though the name patch had long since faded. His prosthetic arm clicked faintly when he walked, but he never used it as a crutch. The pain, he said, was manageable. It was the memories that were unbearable. People in town thought he was just the guy with the cart, but no one knew he had once rewired an IED jam that saved 6 Marines. That same day, a roadside ambush had torn his team apart. And when he came home, his paperwork got lost in transition. His benefits delayed. His therapy rationed. "They teach you to survive war," he once told Alma, "but not the peace that comes after." So Lise adapted. He scavenged old parts from the dump. Fixed up wheelchairs, hearing aids, canes. He never charged. Just asked for stories. Most people didn't have any to give. Except for Alma. She gave him laughter. Half sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. And dignity, the rarest currency in South Ellington. Then there was B.O. If you asked anyone on the east side, B.O. was that mutt. But B.O. had a badge once. He was trained by the K9 unit of precinct. 19. He'd sniffed out drugs in high schools and chased down suspects in alleys slick with rain. His last partner, Officer Denny, had called him the best nose I ever worked with. But Denny had died in a collision on Highway 31, and B.O. had no family clause. When no one came for him, he was caged. Then tagged for euthanasia. That's when Alma intervened. She had seen his photo in a shelter bulletin taped to a mailbox. Something in his eyes reminded her of Marsher's. Of loyalty under pressure. She showed up the next morning with $40, a leash made from Layla's jump rope, and a promise. They threw you out like they throw out people. Not on my watch, sugar. B.O. had been hers ever since. He slept by her bed, barked when Louise had night terrors, licked Layla's hands when her nightmares chased her awake. And when they walked down the street together, B.O. looked each stranger in the eye as if to say, this one's not alone. Not anymore. And then there was Laila. No one really knew where she'd come from. Some said her mother had been an addict. Others said she was just one of those kids. But Alma never labeled her. She just saw the child behind the bruises, the first time. Layla arrived on Alma's stoop. It was raining so hard the drain screamed. She held a stuffed bunny missing its ears. No coat, just eyes wide like questions no one wanted to answer. Alma had opened the door. Said nothing. Then she'd gone to the stove and set 2 bowls. That was it. Layla never left. She barely spoke. But she followed Alma to the library. Sat quietly as she read aloud Baldwin or Morrison or Langston Hughes. And slowly, words came back to her. Why does the world hate brown? She once whispered. Because it's what God started with. Alma replied. Layla believed her, but the city didn't. When Alma brought Layla to register for school, the woman behind the counter had said, we'll need proof of guardianship. Love's not enough anymore. When Alma applied for discounted transit fare, the attendant had asked, are you even mobile? I marched from Selma to Montgomery. What do you think? Everywhere they turned, the system asked for proof of worth, of legality, of identity. But never of story. On Wednesdays, the 4 of them sat together on Alma's stoop, Alma with her tea, Louise with his cigar, unlit for the scent, Beau stretched like a sentinel. Layla nestled beside them with a second-hand book. To anyone walking by, they looked like a picture no one would take. But in their stillness, there was history, defiance, kinship. And beneath it all, something stronger than blood, belonging. That week, Alma's knee began to swell. The pharmacy wouldn't refill her prescription without a new ID. Expired. The clerk shrugged. So she went without. That same day, Louise received a rejection letter for disability benefits again, pending documentation. B.O. was denied access to the library because service dogs must wear regulation vests. And Layla was told by another student that she didn't look adopted properly. It wasn't violence. It wasn't loud, but it was daily, and it was enough to crack any soul not built from stone and scripture. That night, Alma opened a box at the bottom of her closet. Inside, letters, photos, a pressed carnation from a march. In 1963, she pulled out a folded slip of paper, a voter registration card, yellowed and nearly transparent, dated March 14, 1965, stamped in Selma, signed in ink faded to near invisibility. Alma held it against her chest. She whispered, if that ain't proof, Lord, I don't know what is. And somewhere across town, in a sleek downtown office, Derek Harrow approved the final press release for election security. We stand firm against fraud, it read. Every vote must be earned with proof. Election day arrived with thick, humid air and a sky unsure of its mood. The clouds hovered low, unmoving, casting a colorless tone over South Ellington like a faded photograph. The streets, freshly swept for appearances, still held the quiet tension of a neighborhood that knew the difference between ceremony and sincerity. Alma prepared slowly that morning. She laid her dress out like scripture, navy blue, starched, and ironed twice. Her shoes, polished to a faint gleam, clicked against the wooden floor as she moved from the mirror to the door. Layla sat on the bed watching, clutching Bo's leash in one hand and her fraying backpack in the other. The dog lay obediently by the dresser, one ear tilted toward Alma, the other toward the street sounds below. "Big day," Alma said aloud, more to herself than anyone else. "Lord knows they don't make it easy for old bones." The three of them left the apartment in quiet unity. Alma walked with a slight limp, more pride than pain, while Layla skipped ahead, stopping every few steps to check that Alma wasn't too far behind. Bo, alert as always, scanned their surroundings with the practiced patience of a retired officer. Outside the polling station, a modest red brick church converted for the occasion, a line had already formed. Men in union jackets, women with folded umbrellas, young couples in joggers and baby slings. They stood side by side, watching the doors as if waiting for judgment. Inside, cameras clicked. Reporters murmured to each other in tones rehearsed for evening broadcasts. Councilman Harrow, freshly shaved and perfectly pressed, stood near the entrance. His presence was not required, but expected. He waved at voters, shook hands with clergy, posed for pictures beneath the gymnasium's faded scoreboard. "We're protecting the integrity of our democracy," he said to a local anchor. "No exceptions this year. Everyone plays by the same rules." As Alma approached, the room shifted. Conversations dimmed. She held her head high, her purse tucked tight beneath her arm. Layla walked beside her, clutching Bo's leash, her wide eyes scanning the space with the cautious awareness only children of struggle truly understand. At the check-in table sat a young woman in a city-issued polo shirt. Her name tag read Megan. She was mid-20s, with bright eyes and a tremble in her voice that betrayed her rehearsed politeness. "Good morning, ma'am. May I see your valid photo ID?" Alma smiled, not kindly, not angrily, just calmly. "I don't drive anymore. Haven't since '84, but I've voted here every year since I could vote." Megan hesitated, her thumb hovering over the iPad. "I'm sorry. The new law says we need a state-issued photo ID. I can't override it." The room went still. The tension wasn't loud, but it spread like smoke. Alma didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. She simply reached into her worn leather purse and pulled out a plastic sleeve. Inside was a black and white photograph, its edges soft and curling. March 1965. She stood, younger then, hand in hand with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. "This," she said, holding it aloft, "is me. I bled on that bridge so I could vote here today." Gasps echoed. Someone behind her whispered, "Is that really her?" Luis, two people behind in line, stepped forward. He removed his cap, revealing his gray streaked hair and tired eyes. "I served 3 tours," he said. "This woman served all of us. You gonna deny her a voice?" Councilman Harrow approached slowly, his expression carefully blank. "Ma'am, we honor your legacy, but rules are rules." Alma turned to face him, her gaze unwavering. "Your rules change to keep people like me quiet. But I'm still here, still standing, still speaking." Layla stepped forward, her voice high and sure. "She's my grandma. She's everybody's grandma." Bo sat at attention, ears perked. The crowd began to murmur, not with discontent, but solidarity. A white woman in scrubs said, "She taught my mother." A man in a mechanic's uniform added, "She taught this town." Alma looked back at Megan, who sat frozen. "You don't need to break the rules," Alma said. "You just need to see me." Megan reached out slowly and pressed the screen. "Alma." Geneva Williams confirmed. Applause rose like a wave, and Alma, tears unshed but glistening, walked forward, her ballot in hand, history in her heart, She didn't just vote that day. She reminded everyone why voting mattered, outside the gym. The air had changed. A breeze had picked up, moving the trees like a congregation swaying to a hymn. And B.O., old warrior that he was, lifted his nose and barked once into the wind, a sound that echoed longer than any speech. Reporters scrambled to adjust their angles. The photograph held in Alma's hand became the focal point of dozens of news segments that evening. Within hours, it was on social media, accompanied by captions like "Legacy Denied" and "Bridge to Ballot." By dusk, a small vigil had formed on the steps of the church, #polling station. People lit candles, some sang old freedom songs. Others simply stood in silence, holding photos of their parents and grandparents who had once marched beside Alma. Later that night, Alma sat quietly at home with Layla asleep beside her and B.O. curled at her feet. She didn't turn on the TV. She didn't need to. The memory of that room, that stillness, the swell of support, was enough to hold her. She opened her Bible and placed the photo between its pages, not as a bookmark, but as proof that some battles may bend with time, but they never truly end. Not until every voice is heard. The morning after the photograph spread across the country, the mailbox outside Alma Williams' apartment groaned under the weight of envelopes, not bills, not advertisements, but letters handwritten, typed, scrawled on napkins and stationery, some misspelled, some barely legible. But all of them said the same thing: "Thank you. I saw you on the news. You reminded me why my grandmother marched." A middle school class from Vermont sent 29 drawings of Alma and Dr. King crossing the bridge. A veteran from Montana mailed his Purple Heart ribbon with a note: "You deserve this more than I ever did." A woman in Kansas confessed that she'd never voted before, but would now, because Alma reminded her what it meant. In South Ellington, the air was no longer heavy, but charged with memory, with reckoning, with possibility. At the corner of Cypress and Jefferson, the sidewalk where Alma once sat became a site of quiet pilgrimage. People left flowers, candles, post-it notes with prayers. Inside the city, things moved faster. The mayor called an emergency meeting. The city council issued a statement. Harrow tried to soften his rhetoric. The incident, he called it, a misunderstanding, a misapplication of policy. But no one bought it, because what happened at that polling station wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a rupture, an old wound torn open again, the past demanding to be acknowledged. Churches spoke her name in pulpits. Activists quoted her words in marchers. Hashtags bloomed like wildflowers. Hashtag see me. Hashtag let her vote. Hashtag Alma's bridge. The photo faded, worn, real appeared on murals overnight. Someone projected it onto the courthouse wall in the dead of night. Someone else printed it on t-shirts. Profits going to literacy programs for senior citizens. Alma refused interviews. For a week. "I said what I said," she told Louise as they shared a peach cobbler on the stoop. "Now let them chew on it." But whispers of her past began to rise. A professor from Howard University dug up old footage from the 60s. Grainy reels of Alma being shoved by state troopers. A hospital record. Concussion, broken wrist, fractured ribs. She never told anyone about that. Layla asked why. Alma looked out the window for a long time before answering. "Because surviving is louder than remembering, baby. And for too long, we weren't allowed to do both." Luis finally spoke to a journalist. He told them about the night Alma found B.O. in the shelter. About how she fed him from the little she had. About how B.O., once trained to attack, now laid his head gently in the lap of children. "She took what the world threw away," he said, "and made it sacred again." Old students began to visit. One brought flowers. One brought a book she had lent him 30 years ago. One just cried. Alma didn't always remember their names, but she remembered their voices. "I always knew y'all would come back," she said, squeezing their hands. You just needed time to grow into the words. Layla started writing letters back. She signed them, with respect on behalf of Miss Alma. Theo got a new vest, donated by a retired officer in New York. It read, Public Defender. Meanwhile, Harrow was losing control. His phone buzzed with calls he didn't want to take. Protesters camped outside his office. A recall petition gained 15,000 signatures in 4 days. He tried to spin it, called for unity, claimed he too had ancestors who marched. But the silence in response was louder than any cheer he'd ever heard. At a community forum, a teenager stood up and asked, "Councilman, what did you bleed for?" He had no answer. In the town hall, Alma finally spoke again. She didn't raise her voice, didn't shame anyone. She just said, "They told us to wait, to go slow, to follow rules written after they closed the doors. But justice delayed is not justice. Practiced, and dignity withheld is dignity denied." The room stood, not in applause, in witness. That night, Layla asked if Alma was tired. Alma smiled, leaned back and said, "Tired? Baby, I've been tired since '63. But I ain't finished yet." She WSN single quotes T. 2 days later, Alma received an invitation from the State University to speak at their annual Civil Rights Memorial Lecture. She said no, then yes, then no again. "I'm not a symbol," she said to Luis. "No," he replied. "You're a compass." And so she went. She wore her blue dress and pinned the photo to her chest. The auditorium filled to capacity. Students sat cross-legged on the floor. Faculty lined the walls. Layla stood at the podium first and introduced her with words that made Alma blink hard. "She didn't raise me with books. She raised me with truth. And some truths you don't learn from libraries. You learn them from scars." When Alma spoke, she did not give a speech. She told a story about shoes too tight, about water hoses, about not being allowed to use the library. She now donated to about the day she held her friend Clara's hand as they crossed the bridge, and how Clara never made it across. About watching people who once called her girl now ask for her vote. About the smell of tear gas, the feel of gravel in a bleeding knee, the sound of her own heartbeat behind riot police. She ended with a whisper. "You don't need to shout to be heard. You just need not to stop." The room stayed quiet for a long time. Then someone stood. Then another. And another. Until the whole hall rose in reverence. Not applause, but gratitude. That night, Alma placed the photo back in her Bible, not to hide it, but to remind herself that history was not behind her. It was all around her, and it was still being written. A week after Alma's speech, South Ellington began to shift in subtle, undeniable ways. Not through proclamations or policies, not yet, but in glances that lingered longer, in hands that reached across aisles, in silences that began to carry a new weight. Luis, who for years had quietly repaired broken chairs and rusted walkers, found himself approached by Councilwoman Linda Cho. She was Harrow's former ally, a policy hawk known for spreadsheets and silence. But that morning, she waited outside Alma's building with coffee and a folded page of handwritten notes. "I want to learn," she said. Lee stared at her a moment too long, then nodded. Later, over coffee at a quiet diner, they spoke of things never previously named. Luis described Afghanistan not in terms of politics, but in sense: diesel, metal, sweat, gunpowder. Linda, in turn, spoke of her immigrant parents who'd never voted, too afraid they'd be told they didn't belong. That day, they didn't fix anything, but they understood a little more. At the community center, something stranger happened. Officer Grant, once known for giving Layla and her friends suspicious looks, asked to speak at youth night. No script, just presence. He stood before 30 teenagers and said simply, "I grew up thinking that safety looked like silence, but maybe it looks like listening." It wasn't eloquent, but it was honest. And when he finished, one of Layla's classmates offered him a seat beside the drum circle. Meanwhile, the mayor, pressured by the groundswell, appointed a new civic advisory board. And on it sat a janitor, a high school junior, a retired librarian, and a young mother who cleaned houses by day and ran a mutual aid fridge by night. Strange alliances, the papers called them, but Alma smiled when she read the headline. Ain't strange if you know how bridges are built. Harrow, now largely silent, became an observer in his own city. He walked the same streets but found doors no longer opened at his knock. At a downtown bakery, the owner once greeted him by name. Now she simply pointed to the self-serve coffee pot. He began spending afternoons at the library. At first, alone. Then, without anyone asking, he began reshelving books. One day, Alma found him crouched in the large print aisle. She didn't scold, didn't smile. She just said, "Takes a strong back to carry a shifted load. Keep lifting." And she walked away. At school, Layla was asked to speak to the 4th grade class. She stood behind a plastic podium with chipped edges and told them about bridges. They don't just connect places, she said. They connect people who thought they had nothing in common. In the back, the janitor clapped first, and so the town moved. Inch by inch, the woman who once refused to sit beside Alma at the bus stop now brought her extra peaches from the market. The former pastor who said the pulpit is no place for politics invited Alma to lead prayer. The boy who laughed at Bo's limp now knelt down and offered him his lunch sandwich. None of it was dramatic. None of it was perfect, but it was something. And in a town where the past had always lived louder than the present, that meant everything. On the first Sunday of the new month, Alma sat outside her building and watched as a street musician played "We Shall Overcome" on a trumpet that cracked on the high notes. She didn't hum along. She just listened. Because sometimes progress sounds like music made by people who never played together before. Sometimes it sounds like hope finding its harmony in strange alliances. It started with a letter, a plain envelope, no return address, delivered not to Alma, but to the city clerk's office. Inside was a spreadsheet, pages and pages of names: seniors, veterans, low-income citizens. Nearly all of them people of color. They were names that had been quietly purged from the voter rolls in the months leading up to the election. The file included dates, memos, signatures, and at the bottom, buried in metadata only a few savvy reporters noticed, was a digital trail that led straight back to Derek Harrow's old chief of staff. When the story broke, the city gasped. This wasn't just a moment of moral failure. This was strategy. Targeted. Quiet. Devastating. The same week, Alma received a voicemail from a woman who identified herself only as Rosa. "They took my mother off the rolls. She marched with you in Montgomery. I still have her shoes, size 6, white, torn laces. They told her she couldn't vote. She cried. Then she said your name. Said you were the brave one." Alma sat in silence for a long time after that. Then she rose, put on her coat, and walked to the church. By dusk, the pews were full. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She read the names. One by one. First names, ages, years lived. Marches walked. Votes cast and denied. Every name she read was a bell rung in the minds of those listening. When she finished, the room didn't clap. It rose. Lou stood. Layla stood. The entire congregation stood, not in applause, but in purpose. Outside, protest signs began to rise again. But this time, they weren't just painted by the young. This time, elders marched beside them. Teachers, bus drivers, nurses, grocery clerks, and not just in South Ellington. In 5 cities across the state, similar lists surfaced. Quiet voter. Purges, disproportionate effects. A pattern. A movement began to form. And in the middle of it stood Alma. Not as a symbol. Not as a martyr. But as a woman with a voice. Meanwhile, Harrow vanished from public view. He didn't return calls. He didn't appear at council meetings. Rumors spread that he was preparing a statement or fleeing indictment or simply unraveling. One night, under cover of darkness, a crowd formed outside his house. Not to scream, not to vandalize, but to leave candles. Each one bore a name, each one a person he had tried to erase. The next morning, Harrow held a press conference. His voice cracked. His hands trembled. He didn't deny the evidence. He didn't apologize. He just said, "I was wrong. And I'm scared of what that means." That same day, the governor called for a statewide audit. Layla watched the news that night beside Alma. She didn't cheer. She didn't smile. She simply said, "It's happening." Alma nodded. Turning points don't come with fanfare. They come with choices. And South Ellington quietly, firmly had made one. From this point on, everything would be different, or nothing. There are moments in a town's history when everything pauses, not out of fear, not out of confusion, but because something sacred is being weighed. South Ellington stood at that edge. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse steps filled before the sun had even cleared the church steeples. Not with shouts or chants, but with quiet. People brought chairs, blankets, thermoses of coffee. Some held old protest signs, the ink faded. Others wore buttons they hadn't taken out since single quotes 6-8. Inside, the chamber buzzed with anticipation. Harrow would testify under oath. The audit had confirmed it. Tens of thousands purged. Most without notification. All without justification. Alma did not attend for spectacle. She attended for truth. Layla walked beside her. Luce pushed her folding chair to the front row. Bio, too old to climb steps easily, waited at the bottom, his head resting on his paws. The room quieted as Harrow took the stand. He looked thinner, paler, as though the weight of his decisions had finally settled onto his shoulders. When asked why he had authorized the data sweep, he didn't deflect. "I thought fewer voters meant fewer problems." Gasps, murmurs. "I was wrong." And then, something unexpected. He looked directly at Alma. "You reminded me that history doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient." For a moment, her expression did not change. Then she nodded. Once, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement. The reckoning had begun. The council voted unanimously to reverse every purge, every name restored, every apology sent by hand. But Alma knew that wasn't enough. So she spoke. Not just for herself, but for Clara, who didn't make it across the bridge, for Rosa's mother, for the janitor who was never asked his name, for the boy with autism whose registration was denied because his signature didn't match. Restoring names isn't the same as restoring dignity, she said. You can't erase harm with paperwork. You need presence. You need policy. You need memory. And South Ellington listened. The mayor signed a new voter protection law the following week. Alma refused the ceremonial. "Pen, I'll take a library card that doesn't expire instead." And she got it. Harrow resigned. No speech, no ceremony. Just a folded note left on the council dais. "Let the people speak." I failed to listen. Layla was asked to read it aloud at the next meeting. She did, her voice clear, not trembling. Afterward, she turned to the room. "We don't erase mistakes by pretending they never happened. We heal by keeping them visible, by learning, by building new tables and making room for the ones we pushed away." Outside, a new mural was going up. Not just of Alma, but of Layla, Lisbio, the faceless crowd marching forward. Beneath it were these words: "We didn't ask to lead. We asked to belong. When no one listened, we walked louder." And in that echo, South Ellington found not just reckoning, but direction. The seasons began to turn. Summer faded into the golden hush of autumn, and South Ellington took a breath so deep it trembled. At the corner of Cypress and Jefferson, the bench where Alma used to sit was no longer just a bench. It had a bronze plaque now, in honor of those who remembered that Alma still came most mornings, with Bio at her feet and Layla at her side when she wasn't in school. She didn't say much anymore. She didn't need to. Her presence had become a rhythm the town followed. The library started a new initiative, Alma's Shelf, books written by or about voices once silenced. It was curated by Layla and Lise. Every Thursday, children gathered on the library steps and listened to volunteers read aloud from those pages. One day, the boy who once mocked B.O. asked to read from I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. No one laughed when he stumbled over the words. They waited, gently, and when he finished, Alma patted the empty seat beside her. He sat down. That was the benediction, not applause. Not victory parades, but belonging. A new voting center opened at the church. Alma was invited to cut the ribbon. She wore the same dress, carried the same purse. Inside it, the same photograph. Didn't give a speech. She simply placed the photo in a frame by the door. Let them know we were here, she whispered, and then she cast her vote. The final scene wasn't dramatic. No camera crews, no speeches. Just Alma, Layla, and Bio walking home in the late afternoon sun. Louise joined them near the corner. He had a letter in his hand, official notice that his full benefits had finally been approved. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply handed it to Alma. She read it, folded it, and said, "Took them long enough." They laughed. Down the block, someone was painting again. A mural of hands, not clenched fists but open palms, holding books, ballots, leashes, other hands. Layla asked Alma, "Do you think it stays this way now?" Alma looked up at the sky, the color of a hymn. "No," she said. "Nothing stays, but we build, and we bless what we build, even if it breaks." As they turned the corner, the church bells rang, not loud, not dramatic. Just steady. And South Ellington, for once, did not rush to silence them. The past had spoken. The present had listened. And the future had taken notes. She didn't ask for a stage. She asked to be seen. And when the world finally really looked, they didn't just see an old woman with a photo. They saw a bridge, a voice, a truth that never expired. Thank you for walking this journey with us. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to our channel and help us keep these voices alive, one story at a time. Because remembering isn't just an act of history, it's an act of hope.